Okay, I think everybody's in. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you here. My name is Alex Wiseman. I'm really delighted to welcome you all as we gather for today's expanded virtual brown bag session. Today, it's featuring Dr. Floyd Beachum, who I'll introduce in a minute. I just wanted to let you know that this expanded virtual brown bag series is part of a longer series that is part of the Center for Innovative Research and Change Leadership and Education, which we call CIRCLE, and also the Educational Leadership and Policy Program at Texas Tech University. I would love to invite any of you here or any of you watching this video later to please check out the rest of our expanded virtual brown bag sessions. If you Google TTU expanded, it should be the first item in the results list. And please feel free to register for as many of our upcoming virtual brown bags as you can. We really want to see you there. I'm really proud to share with you that if you take a look at our list of colleagues, that there are some great speakers from as close as right here at Texas Tech University, where I'm sitting right now, and all over the country, including highly esteemed institutions like Lehigh University today. So check it out. Who else is speaking in the coming months? Register to attend all of them that you can. Our sincere intention is for ExpandED to empower all of us to make informed choices, to drive positive change, and to really inspire educators and leaders in the field based on the latest, most relevant data, research, and thinking on education that there is. But I'd also like to emphasize that ExpandED isn't just about sort of the delivery of information, it's also about engagement. So it's going to be appropriate, I think, as you're part of the talk today, to participate actively, ask questions, collaborate with us in the pursuit of knowledge. We think that your ideas and experiences are valuable and they enrich our collective understanding. I do ask that if you have a question or a comment during Dr. Beachum's talk, that you post it in the chat while Dr. Beachum is speaking, and then you can save your verbal questions and comments for the Q&A time that will follow. And during that time, you're welcome to unmute and just ask a question verbally if you'd like. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed speaker today. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Floyd Beachum as our expanded virtual brown bag speaker. He is the Bennett Professor of Urban School Leadership at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and he's also a professor in the Educational Leadership Program in the College of Education there. And he served as the program's director for, I don't know, more than a decade. I'm not exactly sure on the number, but a long time. Dr. Beachum received his doctorate in leadership studies from Bowling Green State University, and he also holds a master's in education and a Bachelor of Science in Social Studies education from Alabama State University. Before going to Lehigh, he served as associate professor and program coordinator for educational administration at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research interests include leadership in urban education, moral and ethical leadership, and social justice issues in K-12 schools. He's authored several peer-reviewed journal articles on topics like these in journals such as the Journal of School Leadership, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, Multicultural Learning and Teaching, Urban Education, and the Journal of Cases in Educational Leadership. In addition, he is co-editor of the book Urban Education for the 21st Century, Research Issues and Perspectives, and a co-author of the books Radicalizing Educational Leadership, Dimensions of Social Justice and Cultural Collision, and also Collusion, Reflections on Hip-Hop Culture, Values, and Schools, and the list goes on, many, many others. Dr. Beachum, we're so happy that you're here with us today, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank, first, I want to thank my dear colleague, Alex Wiseman. I've known him for a number of years from our time in Pennsylvania over the various conferences. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with him and, try to make things happen in education. I want to thank all of you who joined us today from wherever you might be. The miracle of technology is really to allow us to make these kind of meaningful connections, sometimes connections that we couldn't have done once upon a time. So we want to thank you for just spending your time here. All right, so today for our topic, and Alex, I assume I have about this is an hour, right?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So what I'll try to do So I'll try to end a little bit early. So we'll have some time for Q&A. Now, you always have to be careful with teachers and preachers and time limits because we always go over in either case. For today, this talk is going to be about what you see here. It's a study, a qualitative study called Living the Legacy, a study of migration, segregation, and education. Now, for this particular topic, really, this is a story. It's an ongoing story. And to create this bigger story, we're going to piece together several smaller stories. And so some of this, what you'll see a lot of visuals here. So I have a lot of visuals and a lot of text. Usually you should have one or the other, but there's a weird combination, but you'll get a chance to see some of this. All right. So let's look back here for just a second. Like I said, I got some visuals here. So as you look here, the motivation behind this particular study was the idea of taking a look at education especially with the South, the Southern United States, especially pre-Brown versus Board of Education, and then in the North, especially sort of after Brown versus the Board of Education and going into the modern era. So what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about the Great Migration. And I don't know if you're especially familiar with the Great Migration, but I'm talking about that big movement of African Americans from the South to a lot of the northern states and also out west. It's probably the greatest movement of people within the continental United States, but it's understudied. It was brought to the forefront, especially in a book in about 2010 called The Warmth of Other Suns, and I'll show you that a little bit later on, by Isabella Wilkerson. And when I read the book, I started to think back on my own time. As Alex told you, I spent time in the South. I spent about 9 years in the state of Alabama, and my parents are from Alabama. My grandparents are from Alabama, but we're part of this migration story, the story of individuals who left the South and went to the urban North. So if you look at the picture on the far left, it's a good depiction of segregation. What some of this was like during segregation. Whites only, color only signs. It was an everyday reminder of the racial hierarchy in the South once upon a time. The middle picture is the picture of the Ku Klux Klan. So you had Jim Crow laws that enforced what you see there on the left, that segregation. Then on top of that was the actual law. And then illegally, you had the Ku Klux Klan, who also reinforced those same laws, but more in a terror-filled kind of way. Now, if you think about this as your daily existence, you can see how this could feel very, very, very bad, problematic, And then over there on the picture on the right, you see an example of colored waiting room. And what we also have here is we have a bus. Now, so what many African Americans decided, they decided to leave the South in droves. So with that, so what you see here, the Great Migration. So in many different kinds of ways, a lot of African Americans left the South by train or bus or vehicle, however they could. And what you see over here on the graph to the right here, you see how the population changed. Once upon a time, the great majority of African Americans lived in the South, and over time, they would leave. And like I said, they would end up going to, and I'll mention it later on, to many places in the North and West, specifically places like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., as far as you go up, going up now. And out West, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all the way up to Seattle, all these kinds of places. So even when you look at these places to this day, you see a lot of these places have large African American populations to this day. And the individuals, and a lot of these individuals have links and linkages back to the South. Here's the book. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. So during the Jim Crow era, the Great Migration, about 1915 or so, approximately 6 million African Americans left the South and relocated to, like I said, the Northeast, the Midwest, or the West Coast, and areas going west to escape the segregated ways of the South. Kind of what I just talked about before. So in this particular study, here's the under-researched area. We were interested, and this was me and a small team of graduate students. We were interested in educators. Many of these educators who lived in the segregated South moved north and then had their teaching careers, most of their teaching careers up north, and then retired. Some of them going back to the South after the end of segregation. So we were interested in their stories coming from the South, going to the North, having this educational career, especially in the North. We really investigated that. And then the tail end of the study kind of looked at some of their perspectives on them going back. Many of them went back home. So yes, what I'm telling you is some of these educators who moved away once upon a time had a long career, and then they came back to the South. This is usually like after about 2005 or so, but many of them had spent 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in the urban North. So studies which target the essence of counter narratives so this is a limited area, is what we discovered here, basically. This particular study examines a specific period where reflection on the past and present is guided by data interpretation and analysis, and it seeks to ask this critical research question: what were the teaching and leadership experiences of post-migration African-American educators in a Midwestern industrial city? So we're looking at teachers, former administrators, principals, superintendents, teachers, principals, superintendents, all who are retired. So these are all retirees. We're looking at individuals who had either lived in the segregated South or possibly even had family connections to the segregated South once upon a time. But the context is going to be a Midwestern industrial city. If you look at the literature, in about the late 1800s, about 90% of Blacks resided in the South. But just like the chart I showed you earlier, this changed dramatically. About estimated 6 million people would end up moving. The highly developed segregated culture in the South, which I talked about a little bit earlier, played a fundamental role in fostering unequal socioeconomic system for Black individuals. So in other words, people lived under this, and I call it a system. It is systemic. I know there's a lot of controversy with the word systemic, but the systemic piece of this is, if you think about it, the systematic bias operates in at least 3 ways. One, individually, person to person, on an everyday basis. When you have personal interactions with people, it reinforced the notion of segregation. You go to a store, you pay your money. People didn't even want you to touch their hands when you exchange money. Sometimes they want you to put your money on the counter, and then I'll take your money. If you're walking down a sidewalk, if you're African American and someone white is walking towards you, the expectation would be you would literally get off the sidewalk, and even if you had to walk in the street or walk through a puddle, then that was the expectation. Individually, institutionally, as all the various institutions during segregation reinforce this, just like you saw. If you go to the theater, you go to a restaurant, you go to a school, you go to a college, all these different places reinforce the segregated system. Here's where you sit, here's where you can get your food, here's, it literally regulated your movements. And then, at least on another level, in terms of if you think culturally, all these kinds of things in the media would reinforce segregation. You would not see yourself in books and movies and all these kinds of things. So in all these different ways, reinforce the system of segregation. So when we say the system of segregation then, or we say a system or systemic racism or these things now, that's what we're talking about. And then now it plays out in the same ways. Here in 2024, systemic racism plays out in individual ways, institutional ways, and cultural ways. And I would even say in historical sort of ways. And then I would even say there's a connection between the systemic racism that we see today connected to the systemic racism of the past. But it's not like this, it's like this. The systemic racism we see today is built upon a huge foundation of racial decisions and structures from the past. So we don't just, so this is the fallacy of the discussion of systemic racism right now in 2024. People want to assume, hey, we're in 2024 and we're just here. You're not plopped in the human timeline with no context. That's fallacious thinking. That's silly. The reality is years, hundreds to thousands of years of bias got you to this place. So when people say, when they mention these things of bias and racism and all this kind of stuff, well, they're doing with a lot of historical evidence. But anyway, I digress, but not really. Because again, this study is, the study I'm talking about is both reflections on the past to make connections to the present. Many Black teachers in the South believed that they had to sustain a sense of mission not shared by white educators. They were preparing students to contribute to a society and to help somebody. They believed the Black community would depend on their students. What this means is, if you think about this now, and I assume we have a lot of teachers and educators here, what this means, if you think about in the segregated South, if you were a teacher there and you had students and you knew that these students had to go out into the segregated system I just talked about, I just elaborated on, then what teachers, what especially Black teachers would do is they would educate the students in terms of reading, writing, arithmetic, all the academic kinds of things. And then they would also say, they would reinforce them saying, hey, look, I know all this stuff is around you, all this stuff telling you you're nobody, you're a second-class citizen, but they would reinforce ideas in terms of saying, hey, that none of that matters. Be somebody, right? They would teach ways in which to navigate and operate within the segregated system for survival, but at the same time, reinforcing and preparing students to go out into that world, and not only to go out into that world, but many times to think past that world. I know you see segregation all around you, but that doesn't mean freedom isn't still here. That doesn't mean we can't fight for a better way. Does that make sense? So again, that's also crucial context for what's coming here. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. So I've been talking a lot about the segregation. So segregation eventually goes away now, but not like that. I talked a lot about the pre-Brown era. Brown versus the board would strike down segregation. Now, many people also talk about this just like, well, the law changed, the Supreme Court struck it down, it's over, oh well, now we can all come together. Everything's going to work. No, not the case. People, school districts, communities fought back. This was a long, drawn out struggle for years. So the post-Brown era brought significant concerns now for Black communities. It was the gift and the curse. The gift was, yes, the walls of segregation came tumbling down. So this means increased access, increased freedoms, right? Even though it was a protracted struggle. But another thing happened. Many Black educators lost control in terms of their schools, because think about what happens here in a community once Brown versus Board happens. You had a largely white or all white school system going, and then you had a largely African American school system going. You got two school systems. Well, of course, we can't afford to operate two school systems, even though you did before. It was not a problem. But the new rationale would be, we got two school systems here in the same community. We can't have these competing school systems. So therefore, we need one. So we're going to merge these schools. But as you merge the schools, we can't keep all the teachers and administrators. So guess which teachers and administrators were most likely going to lose their jobs? Many of the African American ones. But remember what I just told you. In the African American schools, they were teaching in ways in which they had academic preparation and preparation for society and to deal with everything around you. That would be lost many times once schools were combined. There was an element of loss there. Remember that idea of loss. I'll come back to that. Also from the literature, up until the 1970s, told you about 6 million folks already relocated to the various places I named. Estimates reveal about 47% of Black individuals relocated to the West and North. You can see that in the book, Warmth of Other Suns. And although people moved to large cities, others moved to small municipalities or towns with the hope of finding safe neighborhoods, access to quality education, and employment opportunities. A big draw in the Great Migration was employment opportunities. There were a lot of problems, as I showed you, in the segregated South, but the employment piece was huge. It's what brought my father, my uncles, and my aunts all up to Michigan. It's where I was eventually born in Michigan. And so our families has had deep connections to both Michigan and Alabama. I would end up going back from Michigan to Alabama to go to Alabama State, where my mother had started. She didn't finish there, but I went back and I ended up finishing. So you see all these kind of connections between North and South, South and West. This present study explores Black educators and educational leaders' experiences in the school system, especially this northern school system. Through qualitative inquiry, researchers, myself and a small team, uncovered the unique perspectives of retired principals, superintendents, and teachers from about we had them reflecting from about 1975 to 2005. Now, you can already tell a lot gets lost in translation and memory. But this was part of the study. We wanted people to think back and reflect back on a lot of their experiences. So while anthropologists, economists, sociologists, historians, and some educators have studied the Great Migration, they have. Few studies have explored post-migration educators and leaders' perspectives. That's the critical ground we wanted to explore. In terms of, if you think about the methodology, the context for this place, without naming it, I'll tell you about the place. It started with the picture on the right. It was a land of Native Americans who first pretty much dwelled this land. As we were forced out, pushed out, or eliminated by other settlers, the lumber became sort of the big manufacturing emphasis next. And then the lumber would also eventually give way to more people, more cities. And then the big economic boost, what you see here on the left, with World War II and manufacturing. The manufacturing engine would exponentially increase in order to support Americans' World War II efforts. And after World War II, those same plants were then pretty much converted into automobile manufacturing. So automobile manufacturing became the backbone in this particular community. That is what brought my dad to the north and attracted many other people to the north. Because what you could do is you could find a job in one of the automotive plants, support a family, send your kids to college, and really in certain ways live out aspects of the American dream. So for many folks like African Americans and other folks of color, this was their opportunity to start to get a piece of the American dream. However, it's not always clean as it would seem, because the individuals who left the South and came to the North expecting a promised land found a better land, but not the land that was promised, so to speak. The trick in the North is you can come, you can have the right to vote, you can work, you can raise a family, but stay in your neighborhood. There are certain places where you live in northern communities, and you could not officially go and move into other communities. This is well documented. Richard Rothstein, read The Color of Things, The Color of Law, where he goes into detail about housing in the United States, especially in terms of housing and race. And he actually talks a lot about the ideas in which state laws, federal laws, all assisted in this process, and we still feel the effects to this day. What you see here, over on the left, and like I told you, automotive industry is booming, becoming one of the major industries in America, if not the world, right? The production of cars. On the right, you see a picture of one of these communities. Look in the middle of this picture, and you will see a river. This river goes down the middle of a city, separating the city into two sides, an east side and a west side. You probably can guess the pattern of segregation. You probably can piece together what I just told you, because those individuals who move to communities like this were offered opportunities to find houses on one side of town and not the other. The river now becomes the boundary of segregation in the North. And it's not just this community. You may know of other communities like this, and it may not be a river. In other places, it's a wall. In other places, it's a street. In other places, it's a bridge. In other places, railroads. Railroad tracks end up being lines of demarcation, even to this day. So these are the kind of physical boundaries. And remember the idea of boundaries, because I'll also come back to that. So the participants in this particular study, in order to get participants, purposeful or snowball sampling was utilized. So with purposeful, we were looking for individuals. We identified who met the criteria, and then by talking to them, they would help us identify other individuals who met the criteria, and we sort of built out from there. 12 names of retired teachers or administrators were on the original list. We reached out to all of them. And again, here's the criteria: having had to grown up or had immediate family members in the South, had taught K-12 school in the GVSD. And the GVSD is a pseudonym for the Gear Valley School District, GVSD, for at least 5 years, and retired from GVSD as a teacher or administrator. 6 participants were selected for this particular study. So what we did, we talked to these individuals. At least one in-depth interview with possibly some follow-ups. The interview lasted from 60 to 90 minutes on Zoom. 2 members of the research team were present at each interview. One researcher led the participant through the interview process, through the questions. The other listened and took additional notes and monitored the dialogue. Interviews were open-ended, informal, conducted in a very conversational style. We wanted people to feel very comfortable and to share as much as possible. Interview transcripts were recorded on Zoom to create an electronic file and transcriptions. Our transcriptions, though, were created by rev.com. So we did not try to transcribe these ourselves. We had transcriptions. We really liked rev.com. So if you haven't used them, for our qualitative researchers out there, put them on your list. In terms of the data analysis, the first phase or first cycle was open coding. This is a very open coding process. And in this version, this was done by hand. Open coding or initial coding, breaking down, examining, comparing, conceptualizing, categorizing data, basically going through first time to kind of start to see exactly what we're dealing with regard to the data. So we coded transcripts line by line to make meaning of the data. Now in this room I have right here, somewhere in here, I have like a whole bunch of highlighters. So in this first glance of the data, in this first phase, a lot of that's going through different colors, writing in the margins in terms of you start thinking about codes. And I've got those around here somewhere, but you don't need to see all of that. But the codes start to give you ideas of what is happening. Let's see if I have the citation here. I'll show you another citation later. Charmaz is a good one. In the second cycle here, this consists of creating higher order categories. So you go from codes, you have all these kinds of codes that start to pop up. Things like boundaries, barriers, they start to sometimes I call them breadcrumbs. You get all these breadcrumbs. So you actually go through a line of text and then you'll put a code there in terms of you start to develop meaning. At least in this first phase, you're very open to stuff. There are other ways to code in which you have you may have a lens in mind. If I were looking at this study through a critical lens, then as I would code a line of text, I would apply the critical lens to it in terms of thinking why, and I'd be looking for the bias. And there are a whole bunch of other ways you could do this. Saldana does a great job of explaining this process in this book, and I'll show you this a little bit later. Second phase consisted of creating higher order categories based on specific words, incidents, experiences, or kinds of behaviors. In this phase, codes become categories. Researchers collaborated to come into consensus on category development. So in the second phase, we're starting to try to start to make some connections, because now if barriers, obstacles, boundaries if I start to see these kinds of things, they look like they're all talking three different words, talking about the same thing. So how can I take these three different codes, these three different ideas, and merge them into a broader idea, right? And you keep doing this process, going through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of your codes, slowly building them into larger categories. So if you think of it this way, the way that this kind of qualitative research works is if you have a forest, and you look at the forest, all together, it looks like forest, especially on top. If you're above and you look down, it's a forest. But if you're on the ground, though, it looks very different than being on top. So this process you think of it in terms of being on the ground floor. And in qualitative research, you're on the ground and you're a lot closer to your data. You start at the bottom, at the roots. The data here is at the roots. That's where the data is. The data is all the transcripts, all the words that people actually say, building them into codes. So going from the roots to taking you sort of into the trunk of that tree, in terms of the codes. And then as you start to build up into the branches, codes to categories, to subcategories, to themes. By the time you get to the leaves in the top, now you're starting to see, okay, now I got some leaves, I got some themes. But you don't start with themes. We started all the way at data, and I'll show you a visual of this in just a second. Here we go. To the left, data, 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 data. Starting with your data. Data to codes, just like I just talked about. Codes to category. And your categories can take you to larger concepts or larger themes. So you go from the particular, the specific, and build out towards the more general. In the last phase, and by the way, also in that second phase, researchers got together and we started to talk about what is it we're actually seeing. It started coming to a consensus. In the last phase, selective coding consisted of determining connection points for various codes. Selective coding is a process where which codes from the analysis are connected. We start to, again, make sort of these final connections, like, okay, what are we actually looking at in terms of subcategories and bigger themes? The final categories are called core categories and capture the essence of the research. Cresswell, 2013, Cresswell does some great explanations of this. The categories and subcategories defined in the previous stages were linked to core categories. All right, now, at this point, when you have sort of these core categories, the big themes, now you kind of see the story at this point. Now it can start to make sense. And what you do, we'll start to explain, which I'll do in a second. We'll explain our themes, our big categories. And then at the very, very end, we'll go back to the literature to see, well, how does this connect to what's in the literature? And how do I make sense of this big picture? Also, in this kind of qualitative research, the way that we validate is through trustworthiness, credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. We use investigator triangulation, three researchers all talking together, making sure that we're seeing the same things, that it all makes sense. Transferability, using thick, rich descriptions of what's happening in this particular study. So we also have a bunch of notes that we're taking. As we're doing interviews, we're taking notes. Post interviews, we're taking notes. Having a meeting, we're taking notes. All of this to again, to use that to make sure what we're seeing and what we're thinking makes sense. Dependability is what we're talking about. Detailed journals with comprehensive notes, and confirmability. In confirmability, you see a term here. The term is reflexivity. This can be defined as thoughtful, conscious self-awareness. And with this reflexivity that we're talking about here, this is how you insert yourself into this research. So as we explain this in a later article, we talk about each of the individuals, the authors, and we talk about the positionality of each author. For me, this is when I would actually say, well, I'm an individual from this community who lived in this particular community, who has an interest in this particular research. So I'm not hiding that from readers. I'm actually telling you about this, and I'm positioning myself in this particular study because that means this study has a certain meaning for me as somebody from this particular community. And what we would also explain is I would be considered, as James Banks talks about and Linda Tillman talks about, an insider outsider. So in some ways, as I look at this study, I'm an insider because I know the community, I know the school district, I know some of these people. At the same time, I'm an outsider because I'm not an employee of the district and I no longer live in that community. So as I write about this and I think about this, I explain these ways in which I'm on the inside and I'm on the outside, and how I navigate that role. So here are our findings. Boundaries were one of our major themes here. Boundaries. Community was another theme, and enhanced education. Let's talk about each. For boundaries, what we discovered here is that the boundaries in many cases here were, some were physical markers. Remember that river that I showed you a little bit earlier? The river and race ethnicity. It is the same as I explained. People were acutely aware of what that river, the river symbolized, the geographic isolation that happens because of that river, knowing your place on each side of that river, knowing what is expected, right? One former teacher made this, noted this. She talked about there was a black mayor, and what ended up happening, this was during some of the race riots, I believe in the early 70s, there was some civil unrest. And at the time, the bridges that existed were all the bridges that could be raised. So this mayor raised the bridges. And the reason he raised the bridges, it would keep residents from one side where the unrest had started from getting to the other side. So that's why I had I have interpretation down here. During a time of civil unrest in the early 1970s, the bridges were lifted to isolate the majority Black residents to keep them from entering the majority white side of town. So one teacher, as she was reflecting back on her career, she remembered this, and she thought about the ways in which that river, which is always it's always there, for better or for worse. She thought, and what we're talking about here, we're talking about the symbol, physical marker. The river is a physical marker. The other thing we discovered, these psychological markers. The sort of beliefs, attitudes, and practices that stymied the opportunities for Black and other educators of color. But in this study, especially the Black educators, one former administrator noted, is because what she was trying to do, she was trying to rise up the ranks. And she said this, one of the things I noticed, and this was early in her career, like probably in the 70s and into the 80s, I worked throughout the school systems. There were no promotions, and I have these, look at the words that I have highlighted here, bolded. No promotions, no advancement for women, period. And that's the way it was for minorities. The people who had the positions were mostly men in those positions. And if you're a coach, math teacher, or science teacher, you get the job whether you're qualified or not. And that's how it was once upon a time. Some others sort of echoed this. This is unwritten. It's sort of an unwritten rule which became a psychological marker. It's a psychological marker because in people's minds, especially for the women were thinking, they can see the glass ceiling here at this point. They know that there's a glass ceiling. But still, the thing is, even though they recognize it, it still didn't stop them. They know that it's there, but over time, they're going to chip away at it, chip away at it, chip away at it. But there was a keen recognition of psychological markers. Another theme was community building in this case. And notice I have in parentheses internal. So as you see here in this quote, you always have someone reaching back to have a group of teachers that they taught to work with them. So what they're talking about here, they're talking about this idea that if you were a new teacher coming into the community, other teachers would help you. They would rally around you. They would give you material. They would give you advice. Teachers were helping teachers, or in other cases, administrators helping administrators. Over here it says, they pull you along and showed you the ropes and told you how to become an administrator. To become a good administrator, they did not turn you loose and put you in a position without teaching you what to do and how to do it. So there were these internal communities of support, especially amongst African-American educators in terms of teaching and with regard to administration. Why? Because just like I told you, it connects to the boundaries, because the goal was to move past those boundaries. And in order to move past those boundaries, there are certain kind of ways that we can work together and we can collaborate to get past the boundaries. Internal. On the other side of this equation, though, notice here I say community building. Here I say community loss. Over time, the other problem that's going to happen is over the time, see, those early years saw great support in community building. But in the latter years, you start getting into the 90s and the 2000s, you would see gradual loss of community at the same time. Unfortunately, the same environmental elements that plagued numerous urban communities also impacted the GVSD, the school district. These elements included deindustrialization, first off. So remember what I told you, automotive industry booming once upon a time, good jobs, good money, can support a family, all this. What happens though, as William Jewis Wilson says, a sociologist, he said when work disappears, because those automotive plants, once upon a time, there was many as, 9, 10 in this community. Today, I think there are 2, 3. That means most of those plants closed. And just as a sidebar, my father worked for one of these plants once upon a time. And I remember in the it was the late 80s. The plant was closed and torn down. So a lot of those plants are no longer there, or they're now monuments to a time that once was. Deindustrialization, job loss, the influx of drugs, the development of gang culture, the increase in youth violence, and the decrease in student enrollment. All these factors together would take its toll on the school district. One former administrator responded. What happened was our enrollments began to really decline. And you could see the difference. There was a big thing about drugs. It would show up in the children. We had gangs. And then what she's talking about here is older people had to take in the children and begin to parent them. Because now what would happen in some of these communities, sometimes the parent was absent for whatever reason, could be incarcerated, drugs or whatnot, and the grandparent would have to step in and start to raise grandchildren. That's what you see here. That's what this person is talking about. So in this theme, the theme of community is two-sided. Community building on the one hand, community loss over time on the other hand. And our final theme here, enhanced education is what we're calling it. Enhanced education seemed to mean going the extra mile, doing whatever is needed for students. So to some degree, this seemed to be connected to a similar philosophy of education prevalent in the South during segregation. This is what I talked about earlier. Remember earlier when I talked about in the segregated South, teachers were teaching students to be academically prepared and be prepared for the segregated world that they're about to go into and still believe they could be somebody. We found a version of this. We called it enhanced education. Teachers not only provided academic instruction, and this is probably a legacy of what was happening in the South, now playing out in the North, but they also prepared students for the outside world. Back then, it was a world of segregation, but now the world of today is a world of increased technology. It's a world where you may have to face poverty. You may have to face other things. So now teachers are trying to prepare students for this modern world. One teacher, a former teacher, elaborated. We had some people who had a lot of pull in the district, couldn't get around dealing with blacks. So she's talking about some of the racial tension in the district at the time. Go down a little further. She says you have to pamper these kids, and she's not talking about pamper the kids in terms of spoiling the kids, but she's really talking about going the extra mile. Kids from tough situations, you got it. What another person said, you got to right here, you got to show them that you care. Because the kids coming from hard, tough situations, tough love doesn't work all the time. If I want you to be a caring individual, what some of the research says, I got to show you care. You're not going to know caring unless somebody cares for you. That's the point that some of these teachers were making. You need to show them that you care. You have to do some extra things. Show them that you had a heart. Kids needed you to help them however you could. So as we looked at this, enhanced education seems to be mission-driven. It's a mission-driven approach that went beyond formal training and truly addressed the needs of students, especially since many of them came from challenging urban environments. So we saw situations where teachers would have, sometimes they had lunch money on hand to help students. Sometimes they had snacks in their desk to help students. We saw all these examples of teachers really going the extra mile beyond the contract, so to speak. So in terms of the discussion here, back to the research question, what were the teaching and leadership experience of post-migration African-American educators in the Midwestern industrial city, specifically within this particular school district? This study showed that the aforementioned boundaries do not always disappear as progress happens or as time expands. This notion of boundaries. The old boundaries of the South were clearly delineated by the signage. I see white only. I see colored only. I know the boundaries, right? Old boundaries can be replaced with new boundaries or different ones, thereby restarting the struggle to succeed against the odds. So now there's not a sign, but there's a river. There's a railroad track. There are other reminders. And the purpose of the boundary is to let you know where you have to stop. The boundary tells you you can't go past this point, right? There's also an important lesson for current and future Black educators and leaders who may believe the boundaries of years ago are ancient history. There's some out there who say, well, all that stuff that's all in the past. We're all done with that stuff. This study should alert them to the fact that new boundaries are still being erected, especially ideological boundaries. Because now we don't just need, the point now isn't just to have, a river, a railroad track or anything like that. In the 21st century, it is now ideological. There are new boundaries. The new boundaries now can limit how and what can be taught in classrooms. That's all I'll say on that. More discussion. There's a micro community and a macro community element here. Internally, we talked about the idea of how teachers and leaders help one another to advance. So in the micro community, the educators and leaders create classrooms in schools. And this cohesiveness, the cohesiveness that they developed in those spaces make teaching easier, students more comfortable, and education more meaningful. So there's a huge benefit, even to this day, of the idea of a micro community. If you can have larger community, and again, this is the goal of like professional learning communities. There's a whole lot of research out here on this idea. If we can get teachers to work together, if we can get administrators working together, right? This is not necessarily rocket science, but it just reinforces some of the research. Micro community. Similarly, there exists a macro community. So schools exist within the broader community. So whereas a school sits in the middle of a community, there's a lot of stuff happening around the school. And the school can't always isolate itself from that world around the school. Eventually, the world around the school is going to impact that school. The macro broader community will at some point usually impact the micro community. Now, there are ways in which, and I'll mention some of this, in which the micro community can try to fend off some of the things happening around it. And with regard to the macro community, this includes the broader community in which the school exists. So it's incumbent upon these educators and leaders to reach out beyond the schoolhouse doors into community spaces like churches, local stores, after-school programs, restaurants, to make meaningful connections with and stay in contact with the outside community, to have allies beyond the school doors beyond the school premises. Why? Well, because those allies, store owners, folks in the community, advocates can be there to support the school and sustain the school, even as elements of the community are crumbling. That doesn't mean the entire community is just totally crumbling, right? There are always folks out there trying to save the community. So we need sort of these strategic alliances. Black educators and leaders should consider these relationships and community connections. They're fragile. They're fragile. And if you don't sustain them, they will easily waste away. And if you don't have these kind of connections and you become too isolated, like we saw in some of the schools here, then let's just say negative things can happen. Because one of the things I have not mentioned yet, I didn't never mention the fate of the GVSD. The Gear Valley School District, the entire district eventually was closed. They shut down the entire district. Now, the story of that dealt with enrollment decline, test scores, some political things were happening, bad leadership would lead to the demise of this entire district. Now, the death of a district is another study that I can't go into right now, but there are linkages. But what I just saw here, there's some linkages to the eventual decline. So as the community declined in the Gear Valley School District, so did the district itself. Also with enhanced education. This resembled Teresa Perry's 2003 notion of education for liberation, which emphasized students and their needs to be tailored to urban context of the North. What this means is, Teresa Perry said this. She said that education in and of itself is liberation. And she talked about what that meant, education during slavery, when it was illegal to teach slaves to learn how people were trying to get education, and segregation, like I just talked about here, education was important. And then post-segregation, going up to right now, education is important. Education is for liberation in all of those eras. And even right now, while the old markers of Southern segregation did not exist, there were other issues and overt racism and sexism that gave way to more covert forms. Once upon a time, things were overt. You could see it. What this is telling you is nowadays, things are much more covert. People have learned a lesson. Yeah, hopefully very few people are going to be outright racist, outright sexist. The trick now is to delineate and determine the more covert ways that this stuff happens. Poverty, drugs, violence gradually became more prevalent. So schools had to prepare students. So here's the liberation part. The liberation now is to prepare our students for those urban realities, to deal with community decline, to deal with some of the contemporary urban school problems. Education for liberation once upon a time was to prepare students for a segregated society. Education for liberation in the modern era right now is to prepare students for whatever they see around them in their communities and to deal with a highly technological and changing society. To do this, educators, teachers, and principals did whatever they could to support students and show them that they cared. So, as we conclude, let's try to bring this all together. From slavery to today, today's contemporary context, education is still tantamount to liberation. For today's educators, education can free their students from ignorance, from low wages, from cycles of poverty, from violence and hopelessness. While Black people can move across space and time, such as the South to the North, the struggle seems to travel with them. Not to anything of their doing, not to their doing, right? This struggle is one where they must continuously assert their humanity while crossing boundaries as mentioned in the study, building community as mentioned in the study, and enhancing education as mentioned in the study in ways that sustain student learning in the present and in the future. So this whole bullet here, this whole paragraph here is talking about time, space, the struggle, dealing with contemporary issues, and looking towards the future. And finally, a word from Cornel West. There's a great picture of Dr. West here. Dr. West said this: we must keep smiling. We must keep smiling, keep fighting, keep thinking, keep loving, keep serving, keep sacrificing. It's not about the overnight win. It's not about the quick fix. It's not about push button solution. It is about what kind of human being you choose to be and what kind of legacy you want to live. And remember, The title of this presentation is called Living the Legacy. Dr. West sort of ends it. I take you back to the beginning, making that connection, to only bring you back to the end, because that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Beachum, as always, interesting, honest, and inspiring. I can't thank you enough for sharing this research with us and also your insight into it. We do have a few minutes for questions if anyone has a question or a comment they'd like to make. I also have some. I know a couple of you know I'm bad at wait time, so I have some questions as well. But anyone have a question or a comment? Well, I can't resist, Dr. Beachum. While they're thinking of their questions, so I'm really interested in the boundaries that you both talked about from the literature as well as that you saw in the interviews and the feedback from your participants, and especially in the sort of shift in both the physical and the psychological boundaries from the outer community, from the railroads and the rivers and everything, to the inside the school organization. And I'll tell you why, and then I'd love to hear if you have other insights into this. So I can't remember if you've met my kids before, but anyway, both of my kids, one went to Liberty High School in Bethlehem, and one went to Lubbock High School here in Lubbock, Texas. And in both of those schools, they experienced some very real physical and psychological boundaries between their white classmates and the rest of the school. It could have been something like, different floors in the school. Some were in different floors. Some of it was academic programs, which maybe was a little more psychological and sort of access to those academic programs. But so I guess my question is there an effort or a way that educators or administrators or others are working to recognize those boundaries and address them? Or is it we just sweep it under the rug?
No, we definitely don't sweep it under the rug. Now, even though I'm sure there's some individuals who might want to sweep it under the rug, what we would say is here, now me and some of my work, we're doing things like culturally relevant leadership. And let me see here. I'm going to show you all something. All right, am I sharing screen again? Back on the share screen?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Let me see here. I'm going to try to click my name here. All right. So here, if you click my name, are you seeing?
No, we're still looking at your PowerPoint.
Okay. Let me see. I'm going to jump you over to this. All right, check this out. All right. So, and Alex, if you click, like I said, if you want to send this folks to, if you click my name on that, it'll take you here where you can see some of the different work. I'm trying to see if I have it up here. I'm looking for an article called Culturally Relevant Leadership. So to answer your question, I would say we have to prepare leaders, and like I said, we're an Ed leadership program, to prepare leaders to be culturally relevant leadership. And in culturally relevant leadership, it has at least 3 elements. Liberatory consciousness is the idea that school leaders need to raise their consciousness levels, right? In a liberatory sort of way. So in order to recognize the boundaries, you need to read the kind of material and really sort of take the blinders off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As you read literature, especially the literature, like some of the literature in this study, some of the work that I'm doing, some of the work that a lot of other scholars are doing, it's almost like the Matrix. And if you've seen the Matrix movies, it's really hard to explain, but the easiest way to explain it is you have a world that you think, that you see, that's all around you. And the shocking reality is, what if you could take a pill and then you see the world for what it really is? The real world. And it's ugly. It's so ugly that you're like, okay, I want to go back to the fake world, right? But you're better off seeing the world for what it really is, because now you can deal with reality. And so that's what culturally relevant leadership says. Liberatory consciousness sort of pluralistic insight is the second one. The first one deals with knowledge, gaining new knowledge. The second one deals with attitude. When you get new knowledge, what is your attitude? How do you change your attitude? And the third step is called reflexive practice. The actual doing. How do I now go about leading in a different way? And it mirrors the same thing we kind of when we work with teachers, knowledge, skills, dispositions, right? In this case, it's knowledge, attitude, practice. So in order to recognize the boundaries, we need to have knowledge, get the kind of knowledge that supports us so we can identify boundaries, have the right attitude as we sort of work with our people, and then make the kind of decisions on a daily basis, right, that will help challenge these boundaries, break down these boundaries. Because you're right. If we have, most of our wealthy students in the gifted and talented program, and in that same school, we got most of our students of color in special education or in the general track.
Right.
Do I see that and do something about it? Or do I just say, that's just the way it is? Right? Two different approaches, two different ways we can go about that. And I would say that leadership, if leadership is really, really going to do their job, then they need to investigate why that is and will do what they can to change that, because that's an inequitable educational situation.
Yeah. I did put the link in the chat for those of you who are wanting it. Well, we are at an hour, and so I know people are joining because it's a brown bag, and you probably have to go back to work or whatever you're doing. Dr. Beachum, thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who are here, I know we had at least one participant who was interested in the recording. It will be available on our ExpandED website probably tomorrow. It usually takes a little while for the whatever happens in the ether to fix it. I cannot explain enough. I have so many more questions that I'd like to ask you, Dr. Beachum, but fortunately, I know where to find you. So
look, if you want to have me back, let me know. I'm more than Alex. All you gotta do is ask. More than happy to come back.
And if any of you would like to contact Dr. Beachum directly, you've got that link in the chat. That'll take you to his website. There'll be contact information there. And you can always Google him. He's easy to find. Thank you again so much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.